My name is Lenora Chase, and on the night I had just turned 18, my father pulled me away from the laughter and warm lights of my birthday party to say something that still sends a chill down my spine when I think about it now. He leaned in close, his voice so low it almost sounded gentle. "When the party's over, you're going to sign a few papers for Uncle Wade. Just a formality. If you have ever had a moment when your heart dropped because of a sentence that sounded far too ordinary, then you probably know exactly how I felt." I kept smiling. I kept nodding. I stood there like a good daughter who had no reason to suspect a thing. But inside, everything tightened. Because I knew my family well enough to understand that the softest words were usually the ones spoken right before they took something very big from you. I walked into the kitchen, opened my laptop, and while guests were still raising their glasses in the living room, I quietly did something my father never imagined I would be calm enough to do. I completed the documents that made me the lawful successor to the irrevocable trust my grandparents had created years earlier, and by midnight, everything they had protected for me was finally beyond my family's reach. The next morning, my father went pale. My mother was stunned into silence. And Uncle Wade, who had already tried to sell property he had no right to sell, started frantically calling lawyers. But to understand why I did it, I have to take you back to an older summer, to a cabin at Cedar Lake, where I first learned that some things in this world cannot be given a price. I did not fully understand those words in the summer when I was 12 years old. Back then, all I saw was my grandfather standing in the late evening light, sawdust still clinging to his hands, his voice low and slow as if he were talking about something simple. I nodded on instinct, the way a child does when she still believes family is something that never needs explaining. Then I bent down to pick up a few nails that had fallen near my feet, and heard my grandmother open the screen door behind us and call both of us inside for dinner. Dinner at Cedar Lake always had its own rhythm. Slower, warmer, as if time there moved on bare feet. Grandma set down a plate of sandwiches on the wooden table Grandpa had built himself years earlier. The tabletop had tiny scratches, darker rings from iced tea, but it was always clean and solid. I loved resting both palms against that wood while I ate. It gave me a strange feeling, like something steadier than words was holding me up. "Tomorrow I'm going to show you how to read the property line," Grandpa said, tearing a paper napkin in half while he looked out the window where golden sunlight spilled into the kitchen. Grandma smiled softly. "He's been waiting to say that since noon." "Because she needs to know," he said. He did not smile back, but his eyes softened when he looked at me. "If you want to protect a place, the first thing you have to understand is where it begins and where it ends." At the time, I thought he was only talking about land. About the old metal stakes somewhere along the edge of the woods. It took me years to understand that some adults are not just teaching children how to protect a piece of property. They are teaching them how to recognize the boundaries of their own heart, their own decency, the lines no one should be allowed to cross. The next morning, he took me walking along the edge of the lot. The grass was still wet, and my shoes were caked in soft dirt. He nudged a layer of dead leaves aside with the toe of his boot, exposing an old boundary marker, rusted a deep reddish brown. "See that?" he asked. I crouched down and touched the cold metal. "It's so small. If you didn't know it was there, nobody would notice it." "That's right." He rested his hands on his hips and looked toward the trees in the distance. "A lot of the most important things in life are not always big enough to force people to see them." I looked up at him, then back at the marker near my feet. At that age, I could not have named the feeling growing inside me. I only knew that when I was with my grandparents, I did not have to guess who was in a good mood, who was irritated, who was disappointed in me. I did not have to say the right thing to keep the atmosphere peaceful. I only had to be there. And somehow, that was enough. That afternoon, Grandma sat out on the porch sorting old books by the color of their covers. I sat on the floor, passing each stack up to her. Wind came off the lake carrying the smell of water and pine sap. She took a pale blue book from me, smoothed the spine with her hand, and asked in a tone that made the answer feel important before I even gave it, "How do you feel here?" I thought for a few seconds. Peaceful. She looked at me with the smallest smile. Only peaceful? I shook my head. More like, I do not have to be so careful. Her hand paused very slightly on the spine of the book. Only for a second, but enough that I never forgot it. She did not ask me why. She did not make me explain something she had probably understood long before I did. She just reached out, smoothed my hair, and said, "Then remember that feeling." That night, after dinner, I sat on the porch steps watching the lake shift from gold to deep blue. Inside, the kitchen light spilled through the screen door and made a warm square of light across the wood floor. I could hear Grandma washing glasses, Grandpa dragging a chair, those small familiar sounds that seem like they will be there forever. I sat there surrounded by all those simple things without realizing I was being given something very rare. The feeling of belonging to a place, belonging to two people, and belonging to myself. At 12 years old, I did not understand what that was worth. I only knew that every time I had to leave Cedar Lake and go back home, something in me always felt heavier than it had on the way there, as if part of me no longer wanted to leave with the rest. The road from Cedar Lake back to Ridgemont was not any longer than it had been on the way in, but every single time we drove home, I felt myself sink under a heaviness I could never explain, like I had left something important behind. Grandpa usually drove slower in the late afternoon, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping lightly against the door to the faint country music playing on the radio. I would rest my head against the window and watch the trees fall away behind us, trying to hold on to the smell of wood, the smell of iced tea, the sound of the screen door tapping softly against its frame. I did not know how to describe that feeling when I was little. I only knew there were places I could leave without my chest hurting. Cedar Lake was never one of them. When the car turned onto my street, everything became neat again. Quiet again, correct again. The lawn in front had been trimmed. The garage door was shut. The windows were lit just enough to make anyone outside think there was a proper, stable family inside, nothing worth gossiping about. And just like every other time, the first thing I felt was not that I was home. It was the instinct to sit up straighter, as if I were about to walk into a place where I had to be mindful even of the way I breathed. My mother was in the kitchen when I came in. She turned to look at me and smiled exactly as long as she needed to. "Did you have fun?" "Yes." She nodded and turned back to the soup on the stove. "Wash your hands and come help set the table." There was nothing harsh in the words themselves. There rarely was in my house. Things were usually just polite enough that no one could point to them and say something was wrong. But every time I heard a sentence like that, I felt like I had just passed a doorway no one ever truly intended to open for me. Kelsey was sitting in the living room with a new lamp beside her chair, her legs swinging while the television played. She looked up when she saw me. "Did Grandma and Grandpa give you anything?" I took off my coat and shook my head. "No. I figured Grandpa would give you something." From the kitchen, my mother called out in a light voice, "Your sister does not need presents to be happy. Just getting to go to the lake is enough for her." I said nothing. I went to the cabinet, took out the plates, set them on the table, arranged the silverware, placed the napkins where they belonged, exactly the way I always did. I had done those things so many times I no longer had to think about them. Some children grow up learning to speak louder in order to be noticed. I grew up learning when to be quiet so no one would be bothered. At dinner, my father mentioned the cabin almost casually, the way someone might bring up an old item stored in the garage. He cut a piece of meat on his plate without looking up. "My parents keep holding on to that place," he said to my mother. "Property taxes go up every year. The house is old. I do not know what the point is." My mother spooned more soup into Kelsey's bowl and answered, "I've said the same thing. It would make more sense to sell it." I looked up. "Grandpa said the cabin is supposed to stay in the family." My father laughed. Not loudly, not angrily, just one short, quiet laugh, but enough to make my face burn. "Lenora," he said, finally looking at me, "you're 12. Adults say things that sound nice sometimes." I tightened my grip on my fork. He did not say it just to sound nice. "You think you understand my father better than I do?" he said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "It's real estate. If it has value, you sell it. It's that simple. Kelsey kept eating, barely noticing anything had shifted at the table. My mother did not look at me. She took a sip of water and said, as if she were simply closing out a small matter, feelings are fine. But you still have to be practical. Practical. I heard that word land in the middle of the table like something cold and metallic. At Cedar Lake, my grandfather had taught me to notice the things that were small but important. In this house, people taught each other how to reduce everything to numbers so decisions would be easier to make. I sat there between those two worlds, too young to argue, but old enough to feel the first clear crack opening. To me, the cabin was the place where my grandparents remembered what kind of tea I liked. Where there was always a chair waiting for me on the porch, where I did not have to measure every word before I spoke. To them it was numbers. Taxes. Value. Something that could be measured without loving it first. And that night, for the first time in my life, I understood that living in the same family does not mean loving the same things in the same way. The words spoken at the dinner table when I was 12 did not disappear after that meal. They stayed with me for a long time, quietly, like a scratch in glass that only shows up when the light hits it at the right angle. I stopped arguing every time my father brought up Cedar Lake in that dismissive tone. I just started paying closer attention. The way he talked about the cabin was exactly the way he talked about an old truck or a vacant lot. And every time I heard the name of that place, I pictured my grandfather's sawdust-covered hands, my grandmother calling me inside to eat, the screen door trembling softly in the evening breeze. Sometimes the more lightly other people treat something, the more clearly you realize how important it is to you. Then, when I was 14, my grandfather died. On the morning of the funeral, the sky hung so low and gray, it felt like I could have reached up and touched the cold itself. The grass beneath the folding chairs was still wet, and every step left a darker mark on the ground. I sat in the second row, both hands wrapped tightly around Grandpa's blue checkered handkerchief. It still held the faintest smell of pine, a smell I knew would fade eventually, the way so many things in life do, no matter how hard you try to keep them. People stood and sat, hugged each other, spoke the usual words of sympathy in voices that were just low enough to sound respectful. I heard them without really hearing them. Everything around me blurred into layers. Only the casket felt real. Only the emptiness opening in my chest felt real. After the service, people moved into the reception area behind the church. A long table had pastries, coffee, neatly folded white napkins. Everything kept functioning the way life always does after it has just taken someone important from you. I was standing near the wall by the window, not wanting to talk to anyone, when I saw my father and Uncle Wade beside the dessert table. Wade was holding a brown file folder. My father leaned slightly toward him, his voice lowered. I did not hear the whole conversation. I only heard one sentence clearly. "We need to move fast before the paperwork gets more complicated." I froze. Not because I did not understand what they meant. I had heard adults talk often enough to know it had to do with property, paperwork, inheritance. What kept me from moving was the timing of it. My grandfather had been buried that very morning. The dirt over his grave had not even settled yet. And there they were, standing beside pastries and coffee, talking about how quickly things needed to be handled. Uncle Wade looked up right then and saw me watching. His face changed so quickly that if I had not been paying close attention, I might have thought nothing had ever been different. He smiled and lifted his coffee cup toward me. "You doing okay, Lenora?" I nodded. "I'm okay." I lied with complete calm. It was the first time I realized there are moments when you stop reacting like a child. I did not run, I did not cry, I did not ask what they were talking about. I just tucked that sentence deep into my mind and knew something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could never be undone. 2 years later, when my grandmother started getting weaker, Cedar Lake grew quiet in a different way. The cabin was the same, the wooden table was the same, the smell of old books and stove smoke was the same, but in the air there was always a faint weariness no one ever named. She walked more slowly, rested more often between sentences. On some days she still sat on the porch with a thin blanket over her knees, her eyes on the lake, unable to turn a single page of the book in her lap. I went to see her almost every week. Some days just to sit beside her, slice apples, heat water, fold the blanket draped over the chair. Small things, the kind of things no outsider would think much about. But to me, they were the only way I knew to keep my fear from showing on my face. The last time I went, it was early summer, though the breeze still felt cool. The light in her bedroom was soft and thin, like gauze. She was lying on her side, her hands much smaller now, but when she saw me step inside, her eyes still lit up in that familiar way, as if my presence alone made the room less cold. I sat beside the bed and took her hand. It felt thin and cool, but the grip was still there. "Lenora," she said slowly but clearly. "Yes, Grandma." She looked at me for a long time, as if she needed to make sure I was listening with every part of me. "The cabin is yours." My throat tightened. "Please do not say that. You're going to get better." She shook her head very slightly, never taking her eyes off me. "Listen to me. Do not let them take it. Promise me." There was nothing weak about the way she said it. The words went straight into me, clean and heavy, like something that had been waiting a long time to be placed into the right hands. I held her hand tighter. "I promise." She squeezed once. Not hard, but enough for me to know she had heard me. Enough for me to understand this was not a sentimental last-minute wish. This was something she had thought through for a very long time, long enough to know exactly whose hands she was placing it in, and exactly what she was trying to defend it from. She died not long after that. Her funeral was quieter than my grandfather's, maybe because I had already gone through a loss like that once before. Or maybe because grief by then was no longer sharp, only heavier, deeper, like water rising into a hollow that had already been carved out. I did everything I needed to do, with a calmness that felt strange even to me. I greeted the people who came. I thanked them. I sat where I was supposed to sit. I stood when I was supposed to stand. I heard the pastor's voice rolling on in that steady, low cadence, as if it were coming from very far away. But underneath all of it, her words stayed inside me like a needle that could never be pulled out. The night after the funeral, my house was lit up, just like every other night. Dishes clinked softly in the kitchen. The dishwasher hummed. Kelsey was upstairs. I walked into the hallway for a glass of water, my steps slow on the hardwood floor, and then I heard my father's voice from the kitchen. Not loud, not angry. Just the tone people use when something they have been waiting on for too long has finally happened. "Now we can finally deal with the property." I stopped in the middle of the hallway, still holding my empty glass. My mother did not answer right away. I heard a chair scrape softly, the sound of a coffee cup touching the table, and then her voice, low and even. "Let Wade go through the paperwork first." No one cried in that kitchen. No one mentioned that they had just lost a mother. No one said they would miss her. No one said how empty the lake house would feel this summer. There was only deal with the property. Only go through the paperwork. Only language so cold it made the whole house seem to shrink around it. I stood there longer than I needed to. Long enough to understand something that, somewhere deep down, I had probably known long before then and simply had not wanted to name. To me, Grandma's death was an emptiness that nothing could fill. But to them, it was a signal that the calculations could finally begin. Not the grieving, the clearing of a path. I did not go into the kitchen. I went back upstairs, closed my bedroom door as softly as I could, sat on the edge of my bed without turning on the light. The darkness blurred the room, but it did not make the pain any smaller. I thought I was going to cry. I thought the tears would come as some natural form of release, but they did not. I just sat there with my hands on my knees, feeling something inside my chest settle into place, thicken, grow heavy like lead. That night, for the first time, I understood that some pain goes so deep, tears are no longer the first response. After a certain point, you do not break open right away. You harden. You go quiet. You start thinking more clearly, more coldly, as if your heart has had to build itself a different kind of skeleton just to keep standing. I sat there in the dark and remembered the way Grandma had squeezed my hand. Remembered her voice saying each word. Remembered the way she looked at me without even a flicker of doubt, as if she had known for a long time that one day I would be the only one left to keep that promise. And that very night, While the smell of funeral flowers still lingered in the house, something very clear took shape inside me. Not loud, not dramatic, but steadier than anything I had ever felt before. If I did not keep that promise, no one else would. From that night on, I no longer thought of the promise I had made to her as just words to carry in my heart. It became something I had to do, even though at the time I had no idea how I would do it. I was 16, too young to sign anything, too young to sit at the adults' table where real decisions got made, but old enough to know that if I loosened my grip on Cedar Lake, there were people who would not hesitate for a second to turn it into cash. So I started going to the cabin every weekend. The old Honda I bought with babysitting money always rattled a little when it climbed the hill before the lake. But every time the white pines came into view, my chest loosened as if I had just stepped through some invisible doorway. I replaced the torn screen in the back door, sealed the edge of the rear window, swept pine needles off the porch roof, cleaned every window pane until it shone. Some of those chores were so small, no one would notice if they were left undone, but I did them anyway. Not because the house would collapse without me, but because every time I put my hands on something in that place, I felt like I was still holding on to something whole. Some days, I stood on a chair changing the hallway light bulb while dust fell into my hair and onto my shoulders. Some days I crouched by the back door, replacing weather stripping that had gone brittle from the cold. I worked slowly, carefully, almost the way Grandpa used to, as if I was patient enough, the house would keep breathing in its old rhythm. Sometimes I wondered whether I was preserving the cabin, or whether the cabin was preserving the best part of me from drifting away. If you've ever had a place that made you feel less alone, just by stepping inside it, then maybe you understand why I held on to it so tightly. One day in November, the air was cold and the smell of wood inside the cabin was stronger than usual. I pulled the narrow hallway cabinet away from the wall so I could clean behind it, then reached up for the stack of old blankets on the top shelf. An envelope slipped loose and landed right near my feet. On the front was my grandmother's handwriting. My name. Neat and straight, like everything she had ever written. My heart started pounding so hard I had to stop for a second before I could tear it open. There was no letter inside, only a cream-colored business card. Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law. And underneath, in small print, were a few words that made me go completely still. The family trust. I stared at that card for a long time. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a dry, even hush. Inside, the only sound was the ticking clock in the living room. I did not call right away, but I understood that Grandma had left it there for me, and she knew exactly who would be the one to find it. Not my father. Not Uncle Wade. Me. The one who would open every cabinet, fold every blanket, wipe down every wooden surface, because I was the only one who loved that house enough to touch the places no one else ever bothered to see. 3 months before my 18th birthday, my phone rang on a Thursday night. Unknown number. A woman's voice came through the line, low and clear, with no wasted words. Is this Lenora Chase? This is Margaret Caldwell. I'm the attorney who worked with your grandparents. We need to meet before your birthday. I sat up straighter on the bed. What is this about? There are things your grandparents left behind that you need to know, and we do not have much time. Margaret's office was in the center of town, on the second floor of an old brick building. The hallway smelled like old paper and fresh coffee. She looked to be in her late 50s, her silver hair neatly pinned back, reading glasses hanging on a thin cord against her chest. She did not look at me with the pity so many adults had used after my grandparents died. She looked at me, the way you look at someone who has arrived at exactly the right time to receive a truth that cannot be delayed any longer. Margaret opened the file in front of her, turned to a page with my name on it, and slid it gently toward me. Your grandparents created an irrevocable trust 6 years ago, she said. The cabin at Cedar Lake, a savings account, and an investment portfolio were all transferred into that trust while they were still alive. The current total value is about $2.1 million. You are the sole beneficiary. I did not take the papers right away. I just looked at her, then down at the neatly printed lines, feeling as if the floor under me had tilted by the slightest degree. "Does my father know about this?" Margaret shook her head. "No, and legally, he has no authority over any of those assets, neither does Uncle Wade. No one does. None of it goes through probate. That is exactly why your grandparents used a trust." I swallowed hard, because they knew this would happen. She was quiet for a moment, then answered softly, "Your grandparents did not guess, they prepared." When my fingers finally touched the edge of the file, I did not feel like I had just been handed a fortune. I felt like someone many years ago had quietly built a wall around me to block the wind, while I was still too young to understand who I would someday need protection from. When I left Margaret's office that afternoon, I did not feel lighter. I just felt as if everything in my mind had suddenly become sharply clear, as though someone had wiped clean a pane of glass I had been looking through for years. Things that had once only been instincts, chills up my spine whenever my father talked about Cedar Lake, now had shape. Paper, signatures, legal names. I no longer asked myself whether I had been imagining things. I knew. And once you know, the way you see everything changes. From that day on, I started paying closer attention to the quiet pauses in the house, the half-shut doors, the lowered voices that appeared the moment I walked into the kitchen. The times Uncle Wade came over without warning. I was not doing it like a frightened child sneaking around to overhear the grown-ups. I was doing it like someone who had been given the truth and was waiting for the rest to reveal itself. One Sunday evening, Uncle Wade came for dinner. My mother made stew. Kelsey talked about school. My father talked about bills, the store, delayed shipments. Everything sounded so ordinary that if I had not known what I knew, I might have believed it really was just another family dinner. But I noticed that Uncle Wade had brought his brown leather briefcase. He kept it by his feet the entire meal, as if whatever was inside mattered more than the food on the table. After dinner, my father picked up his coffee and walked out to the garage. Wade followed him. The door between the kitchen and the garage did not close all the way. It stayed just slightly open, enough that anyone inside the house would assume they were simply having a private conversation. I stood at the sink and washed the last plate more slowly than necessary. Water trickled over the stainless steel while my heart beat in slow, heavy thuds. Then I turned off the faucet, stepped into the hallway, and stopped in the darkness between the kitchen and the garage, close enough to hear. Wade's voice came through first. "Ridgeline is ready to move at $450,000, Wade said. "I told them the paperwork would be handled. If we stall, they'll walk." My father lowered his voice. "But the title still isn't clean." "Then make it clean," Wade shot back. "If the title is still sitting where I think it is, we move before anyone asks too many questions. Get the paperwork lined up, get Lenora to sign if we have to, and close before anything surfaces." I went still, one hand braced against the wall to keep my balance. Every word hit me cold and hard. My father was silent for a second, then asked the question that tightened my whole chest. "What about Lenora?" He was not asking because he was worried about me. I knew that the moment Wade answered too quickly, too smoothly, the way someone slips a blade out of its sheath. "She's 17. What's she going to do? At most, give her $50,000 for college. She should be grateful." $50,000. I closed my eyes for exactly one beat. Not because it was a small amount of money, but because of the way they said it. As if they could take the promise my grandmother had placed in my hands, take every summer at Cedar Lake, take the table my grandfather built, take the only real sense of belonging I had ever known in my life, and turn all of it into a number polished enough to sound reasonable in front of other people. My father exhaled, still sounding uncertain. "She's gonna push back." "She'll get over it," Wade said. "The girl needs college money, Greg. Give her a check, tell her it's for the family, and that's the end of it." For the family. I had never heard those words sound so hollow. I backed away from the garage door as slowly as I could, afraid that if I even breathed too hard, they would know I was there. My hands were ice cold. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed without turning on the light. Out in the hallway, I could hear Kelsey opening the refrigerator, my mother loading glasses into the dishwasher, life continuing as if nothing had just happened. I pulled out my phone, opened my messages with Margaret, and typed only 2 words. "They're trying to push this through." Her reply came almost immediately. "I know, hold steady." I stared at those words for a long time. Staying quiet while you know your own family is planning to strip you of what belongs to you is a kind of pain that makes no noise. It does not make you scream. It makes you sit very still, very straight, and understand that from that point forward, you are going to have to be strong, in a way no one in that house will ever see. 3 days before my birthday, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in a way that would have been hard to name if you were only looking from the outside. Everything was still orderly, still on schedule, the dishwasher still ran at night, the morning news still played softly in the kitchen. But under all that normalcy was a restlessness they were not hiding very well. As if someone were waiting for a door to open at exactly the right time so they could walk straight through and take what they had wanted all along. That afternoon, my mother sat down beside me on the couch while I was halfway through an assignment on my laptop. She did not begin immediately. She never did. She knew how to wrap difficult words in softness before letting them touch anyone else's ears. "Lenora," she said, smoothing the fold in her skirt as if this were only a small practical discussion that needed to be finished. "I think you're old enough now to understand a few realities." I closed my laptop and turned toward her. "What kind of realities?" "The cabin." Her voice stayed even and warm, the kind of voice outsiders would call reasonable. "Property taxes are rising, insurance is rising, the house is old. Keeping it only drains money. Your father's store has been struggling more lately too. If we sell it, things would get easier for the whole family." I did not answer right away. I looked at my mother's hand resting on her knee, her wedding ring still on the finger she had never once taken it off. She kept going, as if she made everything sound smooth enough, the truth would change shape on its own. "You'd have a college fund. Kelsey would have a share too. Our family could breathe a little. Sometimes being an adult means putting what is right ahead of what you feel." I let her finish, then said only one quiet sentence. "Grandma wanted me to keep it." Something in her expression shifted. Only slightly. A thin flicker of impatience crossed her face and disappeared so fast it almost looked imagined. "Your grandmother was emotional at the end, Lenora." She smiled again, but it never reached her eyes. "Emotion does not pay taxes." Just then, my father walked in from the kitchen, as if the 2 of them had arranged the timing so one could pick up exactly where the other left off. He was holding a coffee mug, leaning against the doorway with the confidence of a man convinced he was speaking for reality itself. "Your mother's right," he said. "I already talked to the buyer. It's a good price, clean deal. This isn't about feelings anymore. It's about responsibility." "Since when is selling something that isn't yours called responsibility, Dad?" I asked, my voice still low. He did not raise his voice. That calmness was what made me feel cold. "Do not talk like that." He stepped closer. "You're part of this family, and this family needs your cooperation, that's all." Cooperation. I sat there listening to that word land in the living room like a block of ice. In my house, people had always known how to use beautiful words to cover ugly things. The next evening, Uncle Wade stopped me outside just as I was carrying groceries in from the car. It was almost dark, the air sharp, the porch steps still damp from the afternoon rain. He sat down beside me before I could refuse, smiling with the easy confidence of a friendly uncle about to guide a younger girl toward the right choice. "Listen, Lenora," he said, elbows resting on his knees. "I've been in real estate my whole life. I know the true value of that land. The lakefront lot alone is worth $450,000. I said nothing. He took my silence as an opening. "I can get you $50,000 in cash. For college. Clean. Quick." He tilted his head toward me, lowering his voice like he was offering me a rare opportunity. "You're almost 18, Lenora. $50,000 is a lot of money for a girl your age." I turned and looked him straight in the eye. "Whose name is on the title?" His smile paused for exactly 1 beat. Not long, just 1 beat. But it was enough. He blinked, then smiled again. "Your grandparents are gone. The paperwork will come to family one way or another." "That is not an answer," I said. The air between us changed right there. He was still sitting beside me, still wearing that composed expression, but I could see the calculation in him slip out of position. He understood I was no longer the child standing in the kitchen corner listening to adults talk. And I understood more clearly than ever that all three of them were moving toward me in turns, each with a different tone, a different style of pressure, but all wanting the same thing. My signature on a betrayal, dressed up in words like reason, family, responsibility. I stood up first. I still had a tight grip on the grocery bag handles, my palms red from squeezing too hard. "I'll think about it," I said. It was the safest answer I could give. Not because I was wavering, but because by then I understood that in those final days before my birthday, what they needed from me most was not real agreement. They only needed me to slow down long enough for them to get one step ahead. And for the first time in my life, I could see my loneliness clearly for what it was. It was no longer a feeling. It was the exact place I had been forced to stand, alone, between people who shared my blood, but no longer stood on my side. The night before my birthday, after dinner was over, and the last round of carefully worded pressure had finally quieted down, I took my car keys without telling anyone where I was going. In the kitchen, my mother was refolding napkins on the counter, as if everything in the house had fallen neatly into place. My father was in the living room, watching the news with the volume low. Kelsey was already upstairs. No one asked where I was going. Maybe because by then, they believed the matter was all but settled. They had said enough, pressured enough, mapped out the road they intended for me to walk. The road to Cedar Lake was dark and empty. My headlights swept over tree trunks crowding both sides of the road, stretching their shadows long before cutting them away in an instant. When I turned onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the lake appeared on my left, flat and cold beneath the crescent moon. Everything was so still I could hear the tires grinding softly over gravel. I turned off the engine and sat for a few seconds in the dark, both hands still on the wheel, as if I needed one last moment before I could step back into the place that had once been the safest place in my life. The second porch step gave its familiar thin, dry creak when I stepped onto it. That sound alone tightened my throat. I unlocked the door and switched on the little lamp beside my grandfather's reading chair. Soft yellow light spread across the wood floor, the arm of the chair, the small table by the window. Everything was still there, untouched in a way that felt almost cruel. I sat in the chair that had once been his, opened my laptop, and looked at the email Margaret had sent earlier that evening. The documents had been carefully marked. Wherever I needed to sign, wherever I needed to read more closely, wherever my role changed once I officially turned 18, she had made a brief note in the margins. I read every line. I did not skim. I did not miss a thing. The legal language was dry and precise, but strangely it did not make me feel disconnected. It made me feel protected. I read through everything once, then read it again. Outside the window, the lake was dark as a sheet of glass that reflected nothing but its own stillness. When the clock on my screen changed to 11:58, I shut the laptop, drove home, and went straight upstairs like any other normal night. The whole house was asleep. The stairwell light was off. From downstairs, all I could hear was the steady hum of the refrigerator. I locked my bedroom door, opened my laptop again, and at just after midnight, Margaret's call came through. She was sitting in her home office, reading glasses low on her nose, the file already open in front of her. Her voice was as steady as it always was. "Happy birthday, Lenora," she said. "Now we begin." I nodded. My hands were not shaking as badly as I thought they would. Margaret walked me through everything step by step. I turned to the first page that needed my signature, and heard the faint rustle of paper in the quiet room. When the pen touched the line with my name, I paused for one beat. Not because I doubted myself, but because I understood that moment was bigger than a signature. I signed. Then I signed the second page. Then the third. Everywhere the pale yellow tabs marked the places for me to act. The ink sank into the paper, and my name appeared neatly beneath words my grandparents had arranged 6 years earlier. From that moment on, I was no longer just the daughter, kept at the edge of important conversations. I was the lawful successor to the trust. I was the only person with the right to stand between that cabin and the greed of the people who happened to share my blood. Margaret looked up at me through the screen. Tomorrow morning, I'm recording notice of the trust and filing the necessary claim to block any attempted transfer. After that, no one will be able to sell it, transfer it, or place another legal cloud over that property. I looked at the papers in front of me, then down at my own signature. A strange feeling moved through me. It was not exactly relief. It was not happiness either. It felt more like standing in a cold rain for a very long time and finally finding shelter, while your clothes are still soaked and your skin still aches. But now you know for certain, the wind is not going to hit you head-on anymore. After the call ended, I stayed at my desk for a long time. I thought about my grandfather. The way he looked at the lake as if it were something too sacred to be bargained over. I thought about my grandmother, about her thin hand tightening around mine when she made me promise. I thought about my father, and a very deep sadness passed through me when I realized I had once wanted him to be the kind of man who would take his daughter to the lake at sunrise and show her how to cast a line, how to sit still and listen to the water against the shore. I thought about my mother too, and wondered whether if she had only asked me once what I truly wanted, maybe none of this would have gone as far as it did. But wishes do not protect a house from people who are trying to sell it. Paperwork does. And in that dark room, on the exact night I turned 18, I understood that sometimes adulthood does not come with freedom or excitement. Sometimes it comes in the moment you are forced to stand up and protect the most sacred thing in your life, even when doing that means facing your own family the very next morning. By the following afternoon, the house filled quickly with all the things that, from the outside, look like joy. Silver balloons tied to the doorway, a birthday cake in the center of the dining table, smooth white frosting with tiny pale blue flowers around the edge. Relatives brought gifts, baked goods, warm congratulations. Neighbors stopped by. A few of my mother's church friends came early. 2 old business friends of my father stood in the living room talking in the low voices men use when they think no one is paying attention. Even Nora Beckett from the house next to the cabin showed up in a beige coat, her sharp eyes missing nothing in that room. I thanked people, smiled, took gifts, cut the cake, did everything an 18-year-old girl is supposed to do at her birthday party. Except the whole afternoon, I had the strange feeling I was standing on a sheet of thin ice, and I was the only person in the room who knew there was freezing water underneath. Then, once everyone had a piece of cake and the chatter in the room softened just enough, my father stood beside the table and tapped a spoon lightly against his glass. The clear ringing sound made every face in the room turn toward him. He smiled and rested a hand on the back of my mother's chair like a man preparing to say something proud. "I just want to say," he began, his voice warm and polished as though he had practiced it, "that today we are very proud of Lenora. She is officially an adult now." A few people laughed softly. Someone called out congratulations from the corner of the room. Then my father went on, more slowly this time. "And because Lenora is now old enough to understand, our family has made an important decision. We are going to sell the cabin at Cedar Lake to secure the future for everyone." He turned and looked directly at me as he spoke those final words. My mother stood beside him, smiling that calm, composed smile. The whole room looked at me too, almost instinctively, as if all they were waiting for was my nod to complete the perfect picture. I set my fork down on the plate. The sound was small and sharp, and I could hear my own heartbeat after it. I never agreed to sell that cabin. The air in the room changed immediately. My father kept the smile on his face, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. "She's just a little overwhelmed," he told the room in the gentle voice people use on children. "Big birthday." Uncle Wade stepped forward from near the front door, still holding half a glass of ice water. "Lenora, this is not the place for this." I looked at him. "You're right, this is not the time." I paused. "The time is 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." A silence fell across the room. I saw Nora Beckett lift her chin. My mother stopped smiling. My father said nothing else. He only raised his glass and tried to guide people back into conversation, but from that moment on, the party was no longer a party. It was just a tablecloth thrown over a coercion that had just been ripped open in front of witnesses. By the time almost everyone was gone and the door had shut behind the last guest, my mother's voice was no longer soft. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" she asked, standing in the middle of the kitchen with her arms crossed. "You humiliated your father in front of all those people." My father pulled out a chair and sat at the table, looking at me like a negotiation had now moved into the part where patience was no longer necessary. "Tomorrow morning Wade and I are filing the papers. The cabin is being sold. You'll get $50,000 for college. End of story." I looked at him. "How much of the total is my share?" No one answered. My father leaned back in the chair, his eyes completely cold now. "If you want to fight this, then from this point forward, you're on your own. College is on you, and do not expect to keep living under this roof." I stood there, letting the sentence pass through me without shock anymore. Only a very clear coldness. On the night of my 18th birthday, my father had chosen to tell me that his love came with conditions. And for the first time, I did not look at him like a man who might be persuaded to come back to me. I looked at him like someone standing on the other side. Someone who did not just want the cabin, but wanted to watch me bow my head and hand it over with my own 2 hands. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The house was still, as if nothing had broken open the night before. From downstairs came the sound of the coffee maker, the refrigerator door opening and closing, all the ordinary noises of a family trying to step into a normal morning. I sat on the edge of my bed for a few seconds, looking at the pale light outside my window, then picked up my phone. Margaret's message had arrived at 8:14. It's recorded. Only 2 words, but I read them 3 times. They carried no sound of triumph. They felt like a steel gate dropping into place at exactly the right second. Around 8:30, my father and Uncle Wade came down the stairs. My father wore the shirt he usually put on when he was meeting with the bank. Wade was carrying the brown file folder, his hair neatly combed, his face still wearing the confidence of a man who believed he was only heading out to complete a minor formality. My father looked at me sitting at the breakfast table with a bowl of cereal I had barely touched. "We're heading out for a bit," he said. I looked up. "Okay." 1 word. Nothing more. But maybe something in my voice made him pause for a split second before turning away. The front door shut. The car engine started. Then the whole house settled into the kind of silence where you can hear a spoon touching the side of a bowl. The call came at 9:22. I stared at my father's name on the screen for a few seconds before I answered. "What did you do?" His voice exploded through the phone, stripped of all its practiced calm. I could hear traffic in the background, a car door slamming. The ragged breathing of a man who had just discovered the ground beneath him was not nearly as solid as he thought it was. I leaned back in the chair. I accepted what Grandma and Grandpa left to me. "You went behind your family's back with some stranger lawyer?" He bit out, every word sharp. "That was my parents' property. I am their son." I closed my eyes for 1 beat. Then I said the sentence I knew would cut through the very last illusion still left between us. "It's not because they didn't love you. It's because they didn't trust you." The line went silent. Not the silence of someone with nothing left to say. The silence of a man who has just heard the truth in his own daughter's voice. When my father spoke again, his voice was rougher, lower. "You have no idea what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. And for the first time in my life, the truth came to me completely naturally when I spoke to him. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there for a long time afterward, the phone still warm in my hand. I did not feel victorious. I just felt tired, as if one part of me had been forced to grow up far too quickly in the span of a single morning. Then things started catching up with Uncle Wade. Ridgeline came back on him for representing that he could sell property he did not own. There were legal fees. There were questions about paperwork he had submitted. And not long after that, his real estate license was under review. In a small town, that was more than enough for the whispers to start. Eventually my father admitted the truth about the store, about the bank debt, about the way he had looked at the cabin as his last life raft. Did it hurt to hear him say that? Yes. because some part of me was still the little girl who had once sat at the window waiting for him to choose her before everything else. But pain no longer meant surrender. That cabin was not their financial escape route. It was the promise I had made to my grandmother. It was the last quiet act of faith my grandparents had placed in me, and no one had the right to bargain with it. A few weeks later, Margaret called to tell me my grandparents had also set aside a $50,000 college fund just for me. After years of growth, it had become more than $58,000. I was sitting in the cabin kitchen, holding a mug of coffee gone cold, and I thought about the price my father and Uncle Wade had once tried to use to negotiate with my conscience. My grandparents had prepared even for that, quietly and precisely, as if they had known that one day I would need a way forward that did not require me to bow my head. Not long after that, I moved out to Cedar Lake. I enrolled in school. I met my parents at a coffee shop in town and told them clearly that I was not erasing them from my life, but if they wanted to remain family, then from that point on, everything had to be rebuilt on respect, not guilt, threats, or money. Later on, Kelsey started coming to the cabin on Sunday afternoons. The two of us would sit on the porch eating pizza, talking about school, about the wading bird that still stood on one leg at the edge of the lake, about the planks on the dock that needed replacing before the rainy season. We did not repair what had broken. But in the place that had nearly been sold off like a piece of merchandise, something else slowly began to grow. And for the first time in my life, I stood on land that was truly mine, without feeling like I had defeated anyone. I felt only that two people had loved me deeply enough to build a shelter over me long before the real storm ever arrived. Some mornings, I still wake up very early at Cedar Lake, open the porch door while a thin layer of mist still sits over the water, and stand there with my coffee for a long time just listening to the wind move through the pines. In moments like that, I often think about something that took me years to understand. Some losses never heal the old way. They do not disappear. They only change form. They stop stinging quite so sharply, but they grow quieter, deeper, and remain inside you like part of your bones. I am still the girl who kept her promise to her grandmother. But I am also the daughter who had to learn how to look directly at the truth, that not everyone who brings you into this world knows how to love you the right way. That hurts. It hurts in a quiet kind of way. The kind that does not make you sob in the middle of the night anymore, but makes you stop for a second while washing dishes, because a voice comes back to you, an old kitchen comes back to you. A younger version of yourself comes back to you, still innocent enough to believe that if she was good enough, she would be chosen. Maybe the hardest part was not keeping the cabin. Maybe the hardest part was accepting that I did not lose my grandparents at the same time I lost my parents. I lost my grandparents at their funerals, but I lost my parents in a different way, slower and quieter, when I saw clearly that they had chosen money, fear, and greed over decency. And there are some truths that, once you have seen them clearly, you can never go back to unseeing. Even so, I still believe a person can go on living without turning bitter. I do not hold on to this house like a trophy. I hold on to it as a reminder that real love is not always loud. Sometimes it is a file prepared 6 years in advance. Sometimes it is a warning squeezed through a hand gone thin from illness. Sometimes it is an old porch that still stands after too many winters, waiting for the day the whole world turns its back on you, so you will still have somewhere to go. And if you have stayed with me all the way to the end, then maybe this story touched something very personal in you too. So if you want to hear more stories like this, about family, hurt, trust, and rebuilding after betrayal, you can subscribe. And I really do want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? And have you ever had to protect something deeply important from the very people who were supposed to protect you?